Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to this month's Tribal Climate Adaptation webinar, hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And the goal of this webinar is to provide information, resources, ideas, and tools for climate adaptation at federally recognized tribal nations across the Great Plains. We are always open to feedback, so feel free to reach out, and also suggestions about potential speakers or formats. At the end, we'd love it if you'd fill out a brief survey to provide feedback. Today, we have Shasta Gaughen, Environmental Director at the Paula Band of Mission Indians, as our main speaker. But first, I'll go through some announcements and updates, and then give a brief overview of the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center before introducing Shasta. And then at the end, we'll leave some time to make sure folks can ask questions or comment. Please note, this webinar is being recorded, as is all the information in the chat box. We'll post links in the chat for those of you online. Also, all participants are currently muted, so if you have a comment, feel free to use the chat box or raise your virtual hand. And then all recordings can actually be found on our YouTube channel. We'll put a link to that YouTube channel in the chat. You can also find them on the North Central CASC website. We'll provide that link as well. So as far as announcements go, the first one, we have an opportunity for AmeriCorps Vista to, in partnership with American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or AHEC, is offering an opportunity to hire a full-time staff member. They'll provide the resources and logistics to add a staff member to your team at a fraction of the cost of a normal full-time employee. And this is an opportunity to add climate change staff or add capacity to support your program. If you're interested, you can reach out to John Phillips at AHEC, and we'll put his email in the chat as well. His email for those of you on the phone is jphillips, and Phillips is PHILIPS at ahec.org. Next, just a note about the BIA's Tribal Resilience Grant Program. We should know back by June 1st about applicants who had applied this last funding cycle. Next, you can see on the screen the 2020 Tribal Energy Webinar Series. It's hosted by the Indian Energy Policy and Programs Office, and they've got a webinar coming up next week, the 27th, May 27th at 11 a.m. Mountain, on the evolving energy landscape and common energy technology options. This was in our newsletter, but if you got that and saw there was a wrong link attached, so we'll put the right link in the chat box for you. Next is the 2020 National Tribal and Indigenous Climate Conference, the first ever conference of this nature, taking place on August 31st, September 4th in St. Paul, Minnesota. As far as we know, it's still going forward and planning an in-person event. Session topics will include climate impacts, assessments, tools, adaptation planning, and mitigation of climate change. And we'll put that site link in the chat as well. Next, the 2020 National Tribal Leadership Climate Change Summit is to be held October 12th to the 14th in Seattle, Washington. This is hosted by the affiliated tribe of Northwest Indians. The goal of the summit is to build on the knowledge and experiences related to climate change impacts, traditional knowledges, develop approaches that prompt tribal leadership in adaptation, mitigation, and resiliency, and foster pathways to influence climate policy regionally, nationally, and internationally. Lastly, if you're looking for events and resources and funding opportunities, another good resource is Kathy Lynn's Tribal Climate Change Project at the University of Oregon. We'll put a link there for you, but this website is super useful. They also do a call similar to this once a month, and actually it starts in an hour. So if you haven't gotten enough after this webinar, you can jump over and join their call. Also, if you have not already joined our newsletter, You can find the link in the chat box if you'd like to receive the monthly newsletter that we send out. Similar to Kathy Lynn's, we send out funding opportunities, events, and resources for tribal climate adaptation. Okay. And now I just want to do a brief overview of the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, or NCCASC. NCCASC is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and a consortium of research entities led by the University of Colorado at Boulder. The NCCASC fosters innovative and applied research in support of resource management and decision-making at the tribal, federal, and state levels. Areas of expertise include, but are not limited to, bioecology, paleoecology, climate science, climatology, and wildlife conservation. The NCCASC serves a 7-state region, including Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. And it's one of 8 regional climate centers and 1 national center. These were created to help meet the changing needs of resource managers across the country. And as the Tribal Resilience Liaison for the North Central region, I work to connect the 32 federally recognized tribal nations with science resources and tools at the NCCASC. We focus on environmental and climate change related issues. Just note my position is supported by a BAA grant, and that's hosted by the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance. And you can find both the links to the NCCASC website and the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance in the chat box. Okay, so now for our main speaker. Shasta Gaughen is the Environmental Director and Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pala Band of Mission Indians in Pala, California. Dr. Gaughen received bachelor degrees in anthropology and natural resources from Humboldt State University in 1996, an MA in anthropology from San Diego State University in 2001, and a PhD in anthropology from the University of New Mexico in 2011. She is Secretary of the Board for the Native American Environmental Protection Coalition, lead of the Tribal Working Group for the Climate Science Alliance, South Coast, and a member of the Institute of Tribal Environmental Professionals Climate Advisory Group. Please welcome Shasta. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and to be able to share some of the work that we're doing here in Pala with my colleagues there in the Northwest, or I'm sorry, in the upper Midwest, I guess. Let me just quickly start my slideshow. All right, so are you seeing the slides?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So again, thank you for that introduction. You aged me, Stefan, by including the dates that I got my various and sundry pieces of paper. But really, even though I have a background in anthropology and I do have that bachelor's degree in natural resources, this is not where I expected to find myself for a career. I wanted to be a professor of anthropology, but I'm actually really thrilled that I've been working for Pala since 2005. I did my dissertation research here on the impacts of the Pala Casino on tribal politics, identity, and culture. And I've been here ever since, and I feel very blessed to have this position as the environmental director and also as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. To me, those two things are inseparable. The environment and tribal culture and traditions are intricately intertwined. I don't see how they can be separated. But these days, I seem to be spending most of my time working on climate change. Actually, for the last 2 months, I've been doing a lot of COVID-19. But beyond that, climate change has been my main focus and a focus of my department, because we all know what an important role that is to be helping tribal communities adapt to the changes that are coming and to assess our vulnerabilities to those changes. So let me give you a little bit of a background on Pala. So as Stefan mentioned, we are in California. We are in the north central part of San Diego County, so the very far southwest corner of the United States. and about 50 miles from the city of San Diego, from San Diego Airport. The Pala community is comprised of people from two distinct tribal cultures. One is the Luiseno, and the other is Cupeño. And that history is a complicated one, but essentially, Pala was an existing Luiseno village that was turned into a reservation under the federal system in the late 1800s. And the Cupeño lived about 40 miles to the east in their village of Cupa, in a place that is now called Warner Springs. And in 1903, after a decades-long court battle to be able to stay on their land at Cupa, the federal government moved the Cupeño people to the reservation at Pala to join the existing Luiseno people who were already there. So over the 100 plus years, 120 years almost since that occurred, together the people of Pala have considered themselves just one people. And Pala is, depending on your perspective, is a relatively small reservation. It's large by San Diego or even by California standards. It's about 13,000 acres, but that's very small in comparison to a lot of the tribal reservations in the upper Midwest, in the Southwest. So we're large by California or by San Diego standards, fairly small by other standards. And yet we still have that responsibility for those 13,000 acres and for the people who live in Pala to help them adapt, to help us all adapt to the vulnerabilities that are being brought about by climate change. And we have an interesting mix of habitats and circumstances that we need to assess for those vulnerabilities and create adaptations. We have mountain peaks, which again, that's all relative. For us, a mountain peak is about maybe 4,000 feet. So that's not very tall. But nonetheless, we've got high ranges where we do get some snow. And then we have river bottom where we have flooding. And then of course, we are afflicted, as a lot of California is, by severe drought conditions. So we have a lot of different things that we need to consider when we are trying to figure out what our climate vulnerabilities are and what our adaptations to those vulnerabilities need to be. So a little bit about the Pala Environmental Department. I have been the director of this department since 2010. Previous to that, I was the assistant director of the Pala Band's Cupa Cultural Center. And the Pala Environmental Department was started in the late 1990s. And over the last 10 years since I've been in this position, we have really focused a lot on how we can bring the community into the work that we do, because we do it for the community. So we've developed some materials and some outreach and some mission statements that encompass the entirety of the reservation, its people, its habitat, its animals. And part of that was creating these groups that we call Planet Pala, because that's what we're trying to save and we're trying to adapt is Planet Pala. And so these words in Cupeño mean air, water, land, people. Those are all the important things that my department oversees to try to develop these programs to protect all of these resources, but most importantly, the members of the Pala tribal community, the people who live in Pala and the people who visit here. And of course, you can't do this without getting the kids involved. So we were really excited to get our Planet Pala kids off the ground. And we have our little mascots here. We have our coyote and our wildcat, which correspond to the two traditional clans that the people of Pala can identify with. And so that's fun for the kids to be able to identify with their clans, and these are fun little animal mascots as a part of that. And honestly, a lot of the adults are like, can I get a Planet Pala Kids? I want to be a part of Planet Pala Kids. We have stickers and we have coloring books and we have, all sorts of fun stuff with Planet Pala, and everybody loves it. And of course, community outreach is a really important part of our work. So anything we can do to bring people in is really important for us. Our climate change program specifically, we've had a fair amount of success getting money from various agencies. So, Stefan mentioned the BIA's funding, and we have had funding for the past 2 funding cycles through BIA's Tribal Resilience Project. And I'm going to be talking a little bit later about some of the organizations and the outreach we've been able to do with that money. We've also gotten money from the National Indian Health Board, which is a subfunding that comes from the CDC, and then they've passed it through to tribes through their tribal communities work. And that's been very helpful. We did have a 5-year grant from EPA that began in fiscal year 2016 to do what we call the Tribal Climate Health Project. Now, what ended up happening in 2016, as you all know, there was a presidential election, and the person who won that election is not exactly a booster of climate change work or of tribes. So unfortunately, we only got the 1 year of funding, the first year of funding for that grant. And the next 4 years, they didn't stop our grant, but they didn't fund our grant. So fortunately, we were able to find money through some of these other channels. And then also there's state money. And in California, for us, that came from, our current project came from Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation. So that's just something to think about, that there is sometimes money available from your states to help you fund your climate change work. I know California is on the forefront of climate change work, so it's a little easier for us than it might be for folks in some of the other states. So when we are assessing vulnerabilities, and I work a lot with tribes all over the country through the Tribal Climate Health Project, vulnerability assessments, trying to figure out what are the most important things to focus on, that's really difficult for a lot of people. And for Paula, you see in the pictures here, there are certain things that really jump out as our most important vulnerabilities, the things that we need to spend the most time focusing on. We have fire. Everybody knows California, we used to have what we called a fire season. Well, fire season is now from January 1st to December 31st. It's all the time. There is no time where we don't have fire. But yet, at the same time, we have the opposite. We have flood. Now, people don't necessarily think of California as being a place where you're going to face flood, but that is actually linked pretty closely to one of our other big problems, big vulnerabilities, which is heat. You can see in that map of Southern California that we've got drought linked to heat as well. So we've got these severe or extreme drought situations. And of course, that exacerbates drought. Drought and heat, I should say, work together to each basically makes the other a little bit worse. So with floods, you would think with drought and heat and fire, a flood doesn't really fit, but it actually does, because the drought, it obviously makes the plant communities more dry and more likely to be susceptible to wildfire. Well, when there's wildfire followed by big storms, we end up with flooding. And when there's drought that really dries out and packs the landscape, that water just runs off the surface. It doesn't absorb very well. And so we have these extreme rainstorm events, which are also new due to climate change. And they just pummel that drought-affected soil. They pummel that wildfire-affected terrain. And we end up with these droughts that never used to be a big problem. They were really a very occasional issue in this region. And now it's something that happens on a regular basis. So these are some of the obvious vulnerabilities that we discovered in doing our climate change work in Paula. Now, we identified those vulnerabilities just because they seemed the most obvious, but one of the most important things that you want to do is, and I'm sure you all know this already, is to work with your community. Community engagement was a really, really key part of doing our vulnerability assessment in Paula. So during various tribal events like Koopa Days, which happens every May, or during our Intertribal Bird Singing Festival, which happens at the end of the summer, we have these opportunities to talk to community members about what they think are some of the most important vulnerabilities. And that's really been eye-opening. For me, I am not a tribal member myself. And so to hear from others what they thought some of the things were that we should be concerned about really helped us to expand the work that we were doing to include things like concerns about native plant communities. So oak trees are an example. Oak trees are a very important source of traditional food, and although nobody relies on acorns as a main part of their subsistence currently, acorns are still important for traditional ceremony, for special occasions. And if those oak trees are starting to die, they're more vulnerable to pests. They are going through a disease that's called sudden oak death. Those are all things that are extreme vulnerabilities for this community because it directly affects culture and tradition, and the things that people find most important as members of the Paula community. So there's so much more to it than just fire and drought and flood and heat. It's all of those things that are affected. So on the other hand, community engagement is one thing when we're doing it at existing tribal functions like Kupa Days, but the picture in the middle there is a little community meeting that we called, and my hope was that we'd get 20 or 30 people at that meeting, and two of the people there, well, there's me and my staff, our tribal chairman was there, and then we had like 5 other people. So honestly, when we get to the questions and comments portion of my presentation, if you all have some ideas for me for increasing community engagement, I would love to hear them. That's always something I hear from others as well, that they really have trouble getting people to show up for meetings about something as depressing as climate change. So I would love to hear your ideas and points of view on that. So as we did our community engagement, we assessed our vulnerabilities. We started to find that there were some things that really stuck out as what people were the most concerned about in the vulnerabilities in Paula. Now, this is the point at which I want to talk a little bit about using consultants. If you have a grant and you have the ability to hire a consultant to help you with your vulnerability assessments, it's something that I have done, and it's been very effective for us. We work for a consulting organization called Prosper Sustainably, and it's a small 2-person operation, but I've worked with Angie Hacker, who's one of the principals there, and she and I together have done a whole lot of work that I'm going to talk about in a second on the Tribal Climate Health Project. But having that outside person who can compile all this data for you and put it into charts and help you write your vulnerability assessments, if you have the ability to work with a consultant, I do recommend it, but it's obviously not a requirement for you to be able to do your own vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. And that's part of the reason why we asked for money for the Tribal Climate Health Project, was so people could use what we've done in Paula without necessarily having to spend money on a consultant themselves, because that can be very expensive. But nonetheless, working with Angie at Prosper Sustainably, we were able to do a lot of work, and she put together some great charts and graphs and things for us that were helpful with further community outreach to show people, this is what people around you think is important. Do you agree? Do you disagree? So as you can see, we've got these spikes of very concerned on a lot of our different vulnerabilities that we've identified here. But it can be interesting to find out too that there's some things people aren't concerned about, like somebody on wildfire risk put that they're not at all concerned. Like, who is that person? I'd like to find them and say, can you explain to me why you're not concerned about this? Because if I was you, that's probably, well, as you can see, it is the biggest concern of all of the concerns that we have listed here. So obviously you want to find out, what do the people themselves see as some of the highest risks? And you also find that you can suggest risks to them that they may not have considered, but once you put that idea in their head, suddenly they go, oh, you're right. Human health is something that we need to be worried about. Now, if I was doing this webinar or doing this talk in person, I would ask for a show of hands for how many of you in doing this work find that there's certain sort of cliched climate change impacts that most people think of first. It's like I say climate change and they say polar bears or sea level rise or melting glaciers. And for a lot of us, we're not concerned about melting glaciers. We're not concerned about sea level rise in our immediate communities. One of those things is the one in the middle, and that's human health. People don't necessarily think about the impacts of climate change on human health. But once you start to talk to them about that and say, well, have you considered how drought increases the amount of dust in the air? And that dust has an effect on your child who has asthma. That's actually a human health impact that you can directly trace back to climate change. Same thing with allergies. Same thing even with things like diabetes. You would think, well, how does climate change affect diabetes? Well, it makes people more vulnerable because let's say you have a high heat day. And because of the high heat in California, we have what are called PSPS events. It's public safety power shutoffs because of concern about wildfire. So even though it's super hot, you want to have your air conditioning on, but people will end up having their power shut off because they want to prevent sparking wildfires from power lines. And if you're diabetic and you need to keep your insulin refrigerated and you have a power outage, guess what? That has an effect on potentially on your health if you're not able to keep your insulin refrigerated and you're a diabetic. So a lot of these things end up blending together into this large category of human health concerns and impacts directly from climate change. So if we move on to Paula as an example, I want to show you how we developed this chart or this graphic to show how these different exposures, these climate change exposures, are related. So we have what we call the direct exposures, which I already identified: the temperature extremes, wildfire, storms and flooding, and drought. Well, what are the secondary exposures that are made worse by the direct exposures? So in our case, we have air quality. We have vector changes. We're getting disease-carrying pests like mosquitoes and ticks that we didn't used to have in the same amounts before climate change. So for example, dengue fever might be a concern, or Zika virus is a new concern. And we've had ticks for a long time, but we haven't always had Lyme disease. And that is a new concern. And all of those vector changes are affected by wildfire, temperature extremes, and storms and flooding. So same thing with water insecurity. Obviously with drought, you're worried about the amount of water you have. And in Paula, we're on groundwater. So if there's a drought, that means our water table drops. And that's an extreme concern for water supply, supply shortages. There's also contamination possibilities, distribution disruptions, all come together under that secondary exposure. And then food insecurity was not as big of an issue for Paula. It's more linked to temperature extremes than anything else. But food insecurity can also be linked to cultural foods. So like I mentioned, oak trees, acorns, that's a traditional food source. So we actually should have, drought and wildfire linked to that as a traditional food insecurity. For some communities, there's a very direct link between food and climate change. So tribes that rely on subsistence fisheries, like in the Pacific Northwest with salmon, or tribes that harvest wild rice in the Great Lakes regions, there's a direct impact of climate change on those particular food resources, and that can cause food insecurity. Same thing with communities that are far from regular outlets for food, grocery stores, food deserts. Those are also impacted by climate change. So again, this is an example just for Paula. This is something that any tribal community could develop to show how their particular direct risks and threats are linked to these consequences that we call the secondary exposures. So ultimately, we ended up with a climate change adaptation plan and a climate change vulnerability assessment, again, working with our partners at Prosper Sustainably. This was something that took a long time, and there was a lot of work that went into it. But as I mentioned previously, working through the Tribal Climate Health Project, Paula has made both our vulnerability assessment and our adaptation plan available for anybody to review, but it's also in a Word document format. So tribes can borrow what we did and then, you know, do a copy replace and just replace Paula's name with your tribe's name. No, not quite that simple. But if you find aspects of our plan that you can use, whether it's just the way we've organized it or some of the actual information that's in it, that's what we wanted to do, was to share as much as we possibly could with other tribal communities, because this is hard work. And if you don't have the money, it's great if you can find resources that don't cost you anything, at least, you know, not an immediate cost out of pocket, to help you develop some of your own strategies, your own assessments, and your own plans. And actually talking about that, well, actually, hold on, I'll get to the resources we have in a minute. So part of my goal when I started working on Paula's climate change vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning was, as I said, to make some of these tools available to tribes throughout the United States. So that's where we get to the Tribal Climate Health Project. And with the help of federal funding and working with Prosper Sustainably, we were able to develop this project that provides resources, data, and templates, learning tools, all sorts of materials that we want other tribes to be able to use for free from our website. So that's where, under capacity building, we have our website and resource clearinghouse, which includes these trainings, the tools, the plans, and the templates. And again, I want to call out the National Indian Health Board's Climate Ready Tribes Project. They provided funding for this. And also the BIA's Tribal Resiliency Program provided some of, actually a great deal of the funding for this. So I can show you a little bit about what we have at the Tribal Climate Health Project. And I'm gonna actually back out of the slideshow for a moment so I can bring up the website. Okay, are you guys seeing the website? Yes. So again, this is the Tribal Climate Health Project website, very simple, tribalclimatehealth.org. And we have these resources for learning. For example, our resources clearinghouse. Now, this is where we've put together all sorts of materials that you can search for. You can filter it by topics, by material type, resource type, by area. So if you want to do here, you can click on this and you can do, say, Great Lakes. And then do a search for, let's say, adaptation plan. I hope this works. And then you submit, and there you go. It brings up 2 adaptation plans, Red Lake Band of Chippewa and College of Menominee Sustainable Development Institute. So these are things that you can then click on here, and it will bring up the plan. Here's the, you know, the keywords, the topics, and then you go to the link.
And Shasta, I think you're trying to guide us through the website, but we're just seeing the about page at the beginning of the.
Okay, well.
And that's okay.
Well, then I will let you guys play with it. I'm not sure why it's just showing the about page, but go to that and take a look at it, and let me know if there's anything that you need help with or you would like to have some help with. Oh, whoops. Let me go through my slides. You can see I'm a little bit technically challenged here. I'm sure Stefan can share the website address with you, but again, it's just tribalclimatehealth.org. So the resource clearinghouse is there, and there's also a bunch of videos that you can use, and there are self-paced trainings, and all of our templates and everything are all part of the Tribal Climate Health Project. So here's a few examples. So this Climate Change and Health 101, that is something that is on the tribalclimatehealth.org website. And again, that's a self-paced training that you can go through. If you're just starting out or you know somebody who is, that's something that you can point them to learn just about the basics of climate change. It's useful for communities too, because at this point I shouldn't be surprised, but I've been doing this work for so long that I have to remind myself that not everybody actually understands what causes climate change and what are the impacts. So there's tools for everybody from the very beginner to experienced practitioners. And we have also links to the videos for our adaptation training series that is ongoing currently. In fact, Stefan is a part of that. He was on our webinar yesterday. And we are continuing to develop resources through our webinar series. We have cohorts from the various regions throughout the United States that are now working together and sharing resources with one another since they share similar climate change concerns. All of these, again, are linked through either the Tribal Climate Health Project website. They're also available on the Paula Environmental Department website, which I can share in the chat box. It's ped.paulatribe.com. So again, lots of resources. That's essentially why I'm here, to try to provide you guys with some tools and where to go to benefit from some of these resources. And that's what I have. I could go on and on. I like to talk, but I see we've got about 20 minutes left. I wanted to make sure that I stopped soon enough to see if anybody had any questions or comments, or, like I said, suggestions for me from things that have worked for you. And with that, I'll just open it up. Thank you.
Thanks, Shasta. Yeah, I've had a question come through while you were talking, referring to working with a consultant. It says, going forward, have you thought about how to balance the expertise that a consultant like Prosperous Sustainability brings to the table with building internal expertise and capacity within Paula?
Yes, and that's a great question. I've thought about that a lot. And my goal ultimately is to take the expertise from our consultant and have enough training and materials and all the resources that we need to start doing these things internally. The goal is never to always have to work with a consultant. The goal is to expand the capacity internally in your own department, in your own community, to be able to take on this work yourself. And in Paula, we're very fortunate. We do have a casino that brings in enough revenue to allow me to be able to hire enough people to do this work. That's not the case for everybody, which again is partly why we're doing this Tribal Climate Health Project, to make resources available to people who may not be able to afford a consultant. But a good consultant in the end should be losing their job. Their goal should be to make you able to do that work so that they can go on and help other people who might need the same help and the same guidance. So fingers crossed that we're at that point soon. And I think we could be there already, but I'm trying to do all this nationwide stuff. And so that's why we're still working with Prosper Sustainably.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right that consultants' effort and job is to make themselves not necessary anymore. Can you talk a little bit about when you first got started and some of the challenges that you experienced and kind of how you addressed those? Because I know, like, for example, you're talking right now about all the work you've done over the last 10 years, just been pretty immense. And I think a lot of folks are still figuring out like how to get oriented in their own communities and maybe dealing with their own challenges and barriers. So
yeah, I mean that could probably be not just a webinar, but like a whole day's worth of discussion. And the barriers are pretty big. So you're starting out first with potentially your own lack of knowledge about the things that you're trying to tackle. So that's a big one. Just learning yourself what the issues are and how they're interrelated, that can be a big barrier to feeling even the confidence to be able to start on this kind of work. And even if you do have the knowledge, another barrier is prioritizing. If you have a lot of other issues that you're trying to deal with, let's say you're a small environmental department, maybe it's just you, how do you balance this long-term planning for climate change with the immediate needs of, say, protecting water quality, or dealing with a toxic algae bloom, or the things that are immediate concerns, and you're thinking, well, I keep wanting to work on my vulnerability assessment, but when am I going to have the time? So the barrier there is not just time, but it's also money. And I hate the fact that that's such a limiting factor for a lot of us with our work. But if you don't have financial resources to be able to hire staff or hire consultants, and consultants are expensive, you know, you're talking like $150, $200 an hour for a consultant in many cases. So the financial barriers can be really big. Another barrier is just that sense of being overwhelmed by how huge the project is. Taking a look at a vulnerability assessment, even that another tribe has done, and thinking, how am I going to make this into something that's relevant to my tribe? How do I do this work? Well, and Stefan and I were talking about this yesterday, actually, and my analogy was that you got to think of yourself as being like, say, a brand new medical student, right? On the first day of medical school, you're not expected to pick up a scalpel and start doing surgery. On the first day of medical school, you're just learning the very basics about the human body. You know, what's a heart? What's a brain? Where are they in the body? I mean, those are stupid examples, but you guys get the idea. You don't have to start diagnosing and treating on the very first day of medical school. But by the time you get to the end, you're going to look back on all those steps and say, okay, now I feel prepared because I've spent all this time, and each thing that I learned just made me get closer to this final step. Or another analogy is running a marathon. You know, I've done one marathon, and let me tell you, one is enough. But when I first started doing that, I thought, I'm never going to be able to do a marathon. That's 26.2 miles. That's a long way. How the heck am I going to get through that? How am I going to train for that? One step at a time. That's how. And you don't go out for your very first training run for a marathon and say, okay, for my first training run, I'm going to do 20 miles. Your first training run might be half a mile. But by the time you've been training for 6 months, even if you're slow, you're ready for that marathon. So I've beaten both of those analogies to death now, but think about it in that way. You know, just take that first step. And I know it's overwhelming, but every little step you take is going to get you closer to having that vulnerability assessment ready for review, getting that adaptation plan out to your community. And actually, I could just leave it at that, because I'm sure everybody who's listening probably has their own examples of barriers.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's what I really appreciate about the Tribal Climate Health project that you're doing with Prosper Sustainably, is you're providing a lot of those resources, and particularly with a topic like health, which I think is less discussed and less focused on in the climate adaptation field. Got a couple more questions for you. Have you had any success engaging with other departments in the Paula government, like housing or public safety, or some of these other departments that may not see themselves as being impacted with climate change directly or in their scope of work?
That is a fantastic question, and actually, it's something I should have included in one of the barriers, which, you know, I don't want it to be a barrier, but the environmental department has a little bit of a reputation that some of you may be familiar with, which is the reputation that we show up on a project that another department is doing, and we tell them that they shouldn't be doing it. Like, why didn't you come to us and talk about this before you started bulldozing in the creek, for example? But, you know, yes, we have worked with other departments, and in fact, I've put together under the Planet Paula umbrella a Planet Paula or a Paula Environmental Department advisory group where we all work together on these different strategies that have an effect on all of our departments, like our tribal utilities department, which is our water system. We have 2 public water systems based on our groundwater wells. Obviously, this work on drought vulnerability and adaptation is important to them. And our tribal services department, they're the ones who come out with their big equipment to try to keep floodwaters from going into some of our neighborhoods when we have these extreme rain events. So now they're on the team with us and talking about, well, how can we prevent these issues in the future? And even more importantly, what kind of grant money is available to help us develop, say, new storm water channels, or to provide more tanks to be able to store more water for when we do have some of those drought situations. So you really do need to bring as many of your department stakeholders together as you can. And even public safety is a part of that. We're in the midst of developing some emergency outreach tools that are related to extreme weather events. And so for our tribal law enforcement and our fire department, we're working with them to hopefully develop a kind of a text alert system where if we're going to be having a public safety power shut off, we can alert people about that. And also a kind of door-to-door check-in to make sure that, say, our elders and our seniors, if they are in need of a cool zone because their power's gone out, be able to make sure they're getting to the air conditioning they need. And that might not sound directly related to climate change, but it really, really is. So that's how you adapt to these vulnerabilities. You develop a community outreach system to make sure everybody is protected in these extreme heat events or these flooding events. So it's not always easy to get people on board. They've all got their own concerns, but what I found worked for me is when I was having trouble getting people to show up at meetings was I finally had the memo about the meetings come directly from our tribal chairman. And you get the chairman's signature on the memo and suddenly people show up.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I've heard something similar with Mike Durgo at Salish Kootenai, and I think that may be the level you have to go to get tribal department heads to attend meetings that don't necessarily fall inside of their scope of work. So that's a really smart way to do it. And the communications plan, we could also spend a whole webinar talking about, but that's fascinating that you have an outreach program and that's linked to emergency services, because that's
we're getting there. We're getting there. It's not there yet. That's one of those plans that I'm trying to figure out the technical side of that, and there's barriers there too. But that's somebody else to work with. Work with if you have one, work with your IT department to help you with those plans.
Right. Well, and I like that a lot because of how many more emergency situations we will probably find ourselves in the next 20 years, particularly in our region, flooding. We're very concerned about a lot of folks experiencing flood events last year. So,
yeah. Sure.
Okay, last question from the wonderful Nikki Cooley at ITEP. Can you give an example of things you do to stay grounded while dealing with such a worrisome issue such as climate change? Maybe soap making or long walks on the beach.
So Nikki is totally that's like a total plant right there. So because Nikki and I are friends, she knows that I make soap. Oh, you know what? What a coincidence! I actually, and it truly, I swear, this is actually a coincidence. I actually brought some of my soap today to give to someone. So let me show you. Here, there's a bar of soap that I made. This one is scented with patchouli. Which in my opinion, patchouli smells like feet, but a lot of people like it. So, I make soap with patchouli. But no, it's a serious question, and Nikki is right to ask it because it's hard. We all know it's hard. This is very stressful work, and we are on the front lines. People don't want to think about stuff that's so difficult. And as an anthropologist, I'm a specialist in, studying human cultural behavior, and human beings just all over the place, regardless of who they are or where they come from, they don't think very well about the future. And so we're the ones who are having to do that and plan for effects that aren't going to happen right away. although they're happening now. But you don't, if you tell people this is going to happen in 20 or 30 or 40 years, I mean, they're worried, but they're not that worried. But for me, it's every day. For all of us, it's every single day. So I stay grounded primarily through the knowledge that I have this wonderful community of other practitioners. Even though many of you who are listening, I've never met you, but we're colleagues. And knowing that you're out there doing the same work, that we're not alone. When I have my moments, that's what helps keep me through. And knowing that I can send Nikki a text and she'll get back to me, same thing. And we all need to do that. Keep our colleagues close. Talk to the people who you know are doing the same work, because they're the ones who are best able to understand.
I have a question for Shasta, Stefan.
Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Good morning, Shasta. I'm from South Dakota, from the Flanger-Santee Sioux tribe, and you had a picture of a road, the flood. You had to put up a barricade on that road. How did you deal with that? Does that happen year to year, or did you fix it so it doesn't happen again?
I wish I could say that we fixed it. And so the funny thing is we have that little river, and for us, what we call a flood here is probably what the rest of you just call a river. But nonetheless, that's one of the main roads to get to what we call the south side of the reservation, across the river. And when that's the San Luis Rey River, and when that river is flowing, you can't drive through there. But that's a BIA road, and we've not been able to get the funding to put in a more permanent solution. So when we do have flooding, all we can do is put up that sign. And we also now have a swinging, like one of those yellow pole gates. We can close the gate. The last time we had flooding, though, somebody decided I guess the gate wasn't locked, so they opened the gate and they decided to drive through, doing that whole, it's only like, a foot of water. And her car ended up a mile away behind the casino.
Oh my goodness.
She got out, she was on the roof. And the fire department, rescued her, but her car was literally buried up to the roof. There was just like a little bit of the roof sticking out behind the casino, which the patrons thought was great. Whose car is that? We got it out. But anyway, the short answer to your question is no. Just when we have floods, we close the gate. Now, fortunately, there is another road that goes across the river, and it's a San Diego County road, and it has a bridge. So people are able to still get across the river on the bridge. But that's in our adaptation plan, is to figure out a way to secure those roads that flood out on the south side, because people get marooned over there in their yards.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Shasta? All right, well, thank you so much, Shasta, and thank you everyone for attending. Please fill out a survey and give us some feedback. If you have recommendations on speakers, topics, things that you think would be interesting or valuable, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.